Good morning. I'm Dave, and I'm pleased we get to worship together today. Every Sunday since July, we've been studying Jesus' Sermon on the Mount together. And in recent weeks, we've gotten to talk about topics that are immediately interesting, like anger and lust. But this week is more difficult. I've read lots of commentaries on this passage, and honestly, they were pretty boring. Some of the other statements in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount generated 10 or 20 pages in the commentaries, but these verses rarely warranted more than one or two. Essentially, every commentator concluded that Jesus wants Christians to tell the truth. Duh! We're confronted with anger and lust all the time, but how often are you asked to take an oath? The next section of Jesus' sermon is about revenge and poking your enemy's eyes out. Now that's exciting stuff. So I considered skipping this passage and jumping ahead to the next. The truth is, however, that this topic is more relevant than we want to admit, and so relevant to me that it's far more uncomfortable to preach about than pornography. As we'll see, Jesus is not really talking about oaths, but using the ancient system of oaths to expose how we find clever ways to lie by complicating the truth. Years ago, whenever I arrived late somewhere, rather than apologize and request forgiveness, I'd blame it on the slow driver in front of me, traffic congestion, or construction. While whatever culprit I named was real, I failed to mention the fact that the slow driver in front of me was only a problem because I left 15 minutes late. What I said was true, but told in such a way as to obscure the real truth, so that I wouldn't have to accept responsibility for my choices. Once, my dad listened to a sermon tape from my first year at High Rock and asked me about a story I'd told, which he thought was untrue. After we discussed it in detail, he agreed that every fact I shared was technically accurate, but I had to admit that the way I presented them intentionally led to an inaccurate impression. I hadn't lied outright, but it wasn't really true either. Knowing this sermon was coming, I've been paying close attention to my words and have been disappointed to catch myself subtly distorting the truth, even though I was trying to be so careful not to. I've always been this way. Maybe it's part of being a middle child. Before he died, when I was 12, my paternal grandfather would greet me with, "So, how's my little con man?" He recognized my tendency to spin the truth to get my way. I thought it was a compliment when he used to joke that I'd be a great salesman. Over the years, I've worked to suppress this habit, but it reemerges from time to time, and I find I'm not the only one. One large-scale study claims that each of us lies about 200 times a day. Parents are appalled when our kids lie to us, but 59% of American parents admitted lying to their children. "Sorry, honey, the candy store is closed now. The iPad ran out of battery. If you keep crossing your eyes at me, soon they're going to get stuck like that." We don't want to take responsibility for exercising parental authority, and then we wonder why they don't respect us. How about you? Can you think of an example of a time when you misled someone to make a sale, manipulate perceptions of you, or justify yourself? You exaggerated just a bit in order to avoid responsibility, embellished to make your story more compelling. Maybe you never intended to lie, but you started to hear yourself saying something that wasn't quite true. Even if we don't lie directly, we find clever ways to use truth in order to obscure the truth. Rather than condemning this kind of trickery, our culture celebrates those who dance on this line. During the 1992 presidential campaign, spin doctors Mary Maitland and James Carville became pop icons for their ability to twist the truth to the maximum effect so that their clients could technically tell the truth while misleading people widely. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." These people made fortunes by inventing clever ways to lie to us, and we applauded them for it. So celebrated were these two that their personas generated a hit TV show, Spin City, in which we laughed along while Michael J. Fox twisted the truth on behalf of a self-centered, ignorant, bigoted politician. Nowadays, we don't need sitcoms to see that. Presidential debates are immediately followed by fact-checkers who rate which candidate lied most egregiously. What we laughed about and celebrated for so long has become reality. Lies are a part of our everyday life. We expect advertisers to deceive us, and we do the same thing. On our Facebook or LinkedIn profiles, we try to package ourselves to enhance our achievements or experiences. In an anonymous survey of 700 people, 73% admitted to outright lying on their resumes. Another survey found that 75% of high school students copped to engaging in serious cheating. Yet another survey found that 86% of Americans said they lie to their parents regularly. 75% lie to their friends, and 69% lie to their spouses. And that's what we're willing to admit. USA Today reported that 82% of Fortune 500 executives polled regularly lie about their golf scores, which seems trivial until you read that 67% of those same people agreed that a person who cheats in golf is likely to cheat in business. One respondent explained, if they're willing to lie to win a $10 golf bet, imagine what they do for a multi-million-dollar loan. I hardly have to mention the 2008 mortgage meltdown or the fraud discovered at Wells Fargo last week. One of the funnier stories I read was about a preacher who instructed his congregation to read Joshua chapter 25 in preparation for the sermon he'd be preaching the following Sunday. The next week, he asked how many people had read Joshua 25 like he requested, and many people raised their hands. The pastor then introduced his sermon about lying by explaining that the book of Joshua only has 24 chapters. Now, I wouldn't do that because it's cruel, but it's definitely funny. Add all this up, and I know that you're liars, at least some of the time, just like I am, as much as I'd like to deny it, but that would be a lie. This may sound dismal, but did you know that several of the Bible's greatest heroes were liars? Abraham lied that his wife was his sister. Jacob deceived his blind father. Peter lied repeatedly during Jesus' trial that he didn't know Jesus at all. Clearly, the psalmist was right when he complained that everyone's a liar. Are we surprised by all this lying? We shouldn't be. We hear it frequently. We do it frequently. The check's in the mail. I didn't forget to call. My cell phone died. I finished the paper, but I left it in my room. Can I drop it off to you tomorrow? I'm glad you're better. I was praying for you. But these aren't real lies, are they? They're harmless, victimless lies. Maybe they aren't lies at all. They're figures of speech, exaggerations, white lies, which we distinguish from the really bad kind of lying that we'd never do. In this way, we're a lot like the people that Jesus was addressing in today's passage who found sly ways to justify their lies. Jesus begins in Matthew 5:33 by quoting the prevailing standard of the religious authorities, which is a combination of two Old Testament passages from Leviticus 19 and Psalm 50. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. Yes, that's exactly what they'd heard, and it makes perfect sense. But Jesus continues, but I tell you, don't swear an oath at all. Well, that must have surprised them, because it was the opposite of what they'd heard from the Lord before. In Deuteronomy 10:20, God plainly instructed people to swear oaths by his name. Jesus seems to be contradicting the Old Testament here, but he isn't contradicting God's law, he's rescuing it. If you've been with us through this sermon series, you've seen a predictable pattern to this section in which Jesus quotes from the Old Testament and then affirms it by challenging the popular ways people had perverted what God said. Just like with the previous commandments concerning anger and lust, people had found clever ways to lie by obeying God's instructions while ignoring his intent. In Deuteronomy 10, God was speaking to people with a history of lying. So God said, take oaths in my name so that people can be sure that this time you're finally telling the truth. But over time, people found ways to sound like they were taking oaths in God's name without actually doing it at all. Instead of swearing by God's name, they'd swear by heaven or Jerusalem. And then it was discovered that they'd lied under oath. They could say, I didn't actually swear to God, only to heaven. So technically, I'm not required to keep that vow. The Mishnah, an ancient book outlining the teachings of the first century rabbis, has one large section dedicated to oaths, including detailed lists describing when they're actually binding. For example, one rabbi explained that if you swear by Jerusalem, you're not bound by your vow. But if you swear toward Jerusalem, meaning that you're facing in the direction of Jerusalem when you say it, you are bound. In Deuteronomy, God was giving a law designed to ensure truthfulness. But people manipulated it into a way to hide their lies. And in Matthew 5, Jesus exposes this duplicity as just a grown-up version of crossing your fingers. So Jesus forbids oaths altogether. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you've made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Forget your silly justifications. Jesus wants everything we say to be as honest as if we were taking an oath. Jesus isn't reversing God's law, but recovering it. God's law had never been about oaths, but about integrity. So just like God was doing back in Deuteronomy, here Jesus is closing another loophole the religious people had created to make space for their lies and irresponsibility. Many people have misunderstood this passage to be prohibiting Christians from taking oaths in a court of law. But that misses the point Jesus is making here. Jesus himself testified under oath before the Sanhedrin, and Paul calls God as his witness 4 separate times in his letters. Jesus isn't confronting oaths, but lies and lack of integrity. He demands all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Say what you mean. No more, no less. Jesus condemns anything that confuses or complicates our conversations so that we can sound like we're saying yes when we're really saying no. I doubt any of us disagree with this in principle. Most of us have been taught to tell the truth since we were toddlers. Even I was taught to tell the truth, and I was raised by a lawyer. But the truth is that we don't always do it. We rearrange the facts in order to misrepresent reality without actually lying, and we legitimate our deceptions by insisting we were telling the truth, literally. But was it the whole truth? When we salt our stories with subtle embellishments to make them more interesting, were we telling nothing but the truth? It's easy for me to preach that we should always tell the truth. But is that really true? On your resume, in addition to listing all of your accomplishments, are you also required to include all of your mistakes? On a date, when someone asks why your previous relationship broke up, can you just say it didn't work out? Or do you have to add that the person found you too needy? Sometimes it's not so obvious what lying is. So I want to consider when we're lying, why we lie, and what to do when we realize we're lying. When are we lying? Sometimes we just blatantly say something false. I forget to do something, but then claim not to remember that it was my job, when I know full well that it was. You skip a meeting or a class because you wanted to run an errand or see a friend, and then you claimed that your car wouldn't start. Other times, I may be telling the truth, but in a misleading way. Like if a creditor calls and I respond, "Oh, what perfect timing. I just put a check in the mail." And I did just put a check in the mail. Not to that company, but I didn't say I put a check in the mail to that company, just that I put one in the mail. That isn't lying technically, but it's using the truth to mislead. It's lying. Many of you know I went to the '96 Olympics in Atlanta for hurdles, though I didn't make it to the finals. That's really true. Of course, I didn't make it to the finals because I didn't have tickets to the final heats, only to the early ones. But you see how easily I can use true statements to create the false impression that I'm an Olympic caliber athlete? When the person finally gets to know me well enough to realize they've been tricked, I could testify honestly that I never said I was an Olympic athlete, only that I went to the games. You must have misunderstood or jumped to conclusions. This is the kind of deception hidden behind the truth that Jesus is talking about. But other times, it's not clear when I'm lying, even to me. At what point am I putting my best foot forward, but not putting it forward so fast as to kick the truth right out of the way? I want to create a good impression, appear charming, friendly, or competent. But when does that become deception? When does spin in a resume or personal interaction become sin? We need to be careful. Because if we try to find too specific a rule, we'll repeat the same mistake made by the Pharisees. We'll find new ways to legalistically obey the instructions while ignoring the intent, because the human heart is deceitful above all things. However, this may be a good rule of thumb. It's okay to put your best foot forward, but make sure it's really your foot, so that as people get to know you better, they'll see that their first impression was not a false impression, even if it was incomplete. Putting your best foot forward is not the same as claiming that both feet are equally attractive. To use another cliche, it's okay to present yourself in the best light. But when all the lights are turned on, people should see something more, not something different. Telling the truth for the purpose of misleading people is still lying. Given that we all agree that lying is wrong, why do we do it? Extroverts sometimes figure out what we think by saying it and then find ourselves saying something unplanned that isn't exactly accurate. At that point, it's awkward to go back and correct it, so we just move on. We need to be slower to speak, as James suggests, or have the integrity to go back and correct ourselves. You know, what I just said isn't quite right. But often, our lies are less accidental. We lie to protect ourselves from experiencing the consequences of our decisions. We don't want to admit that it's our fault that we arrived late, so we blame our alarm clock. At work, we blame the blunder on someone who isn't in the room or isn't in a position to correct the record. At home, we tell people what they want to hear so that we won't get in trouble. Other times, we lie to promote ourselves, maybe to get a grade or a promotion, a client, a date, or approval from someone. How about you? Is there something that you're afraid that people might find out that motivates you to lie or embellish the truth? Maybe they'll discover that you're not that smart, or that you're insecure, underqualified, sinful, or uninteresting. Often we misrepresent ourselves in order to impress others because we're afraid that the truth might not be good enough. And that's the key. We lie because we're afraid. We see how we fail or fall short, and we're afraid that if we tell the truth, we'll be rejected or miss out on something good. So we take matters into our own hands and we violate God's commandments. We fear that doing it God's way won't get us to a good place. We don't trust that people will like us, and we don't trust God to take care of us anyway, to bring us life, love, joy, like He promised. So we feel the desperate need to sneak around and steal them. We're not good enough for God's way, so we try it our own way. But we read in Isaiah that when we do that, God asks, "Whom have you so dreaded and feared that you've not been true to me?" If we're unaware of the truth about God's power and compassion, then it's no wonder why we're afraid to admit the truth to ourselves, because sometimes the truth seems terrifying. do not lie, would be a very frightening command for imperfect and insecure people like us to keep if God hadn't introduced his commandments by reminding us of who he is. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You don't have to lie to protect or promote yourself. He's saying, I've taken care of you before, and I'll take care of you again, so don't be so afraid. Though lying itself is a sin, it's often the symptom of some other sin enslaving us that God's eager to deliver you from. We use lies to conceal our greed, anger, selfishness, lust, insecurity, dishonesty, and anxiety that make all of my lies seem necessary. But the lies don't really help me. They allow me to stay stuck in that sin rather than bringing it honestly to God and get healed. It seems easier in the moment, but usually it just makes the pain last much longer than it needs to. We're not just lying to others. We're lying to ourselves. When you discover you've been untruthful, ask why you felt compelled to lie, exaggerate, or obfuscate. Satan twists God's promises so that we feel afraid to trust him. The lies we speak are almost always reflections of the lies we believe. Lies like, no one could ever love me if they knew the truth about me. So instead, we lie about who we are or what we've done. And we never give God or others a chance to love the person we really are. So that lie about us never gets challenged. Ask what lie you've been believing that prompts you to lie yourself. When we start to identify the lies we believe, often we're amazed that we believed them for so long. It should be clear by now that we're all guilty of lying. If you don't think that includes you, you're probably lying to yourself right now. In John 8, we read that Satan is a liar and the father of lies. Indeed, when we first meet him in the Garden of Eden, he's lying to Eve in order to distort what God said. Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? You'll certainly not die. You'll become like God, assured the serpent, lying again. Just like he did to Eve in the garden, Satan whispers lies to us, insinuating that God's grace may not be enough for sinners like us, or that God can't be trusted to keep his promises to us. But God's told us the whole truth, which is that we're selfish and broken. We're unreliable and liars. He says in Romans 3 that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's the truth. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. The whole truth is that we failed and fallen short, and God knows it and loves us anyway. He's the God who saves sinners like you and me and loves us like sons and daughters. This is why Jesus came. And this is the truth that Satan most wants to obscure. Jesus didn't come into the world just to save perfect people or just teach people morality. The truth is that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God does not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Satan suggests that God hasn't told us the truth about how to find freedom or full life. But Jesus tells the truth, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. Following Jesus is the way to freedom and full life we all long for. For too long, I lied to myself and to others to avoid admitting that I had a problem with porn and anger, which dragged me down for years. But when I finally told the truth about those things, I found the grace and the power I needed to be set free. Satan can't shame me with those things anymore. At the time, the truth seemed terrifying, but now I just wonder why I waited so long. Friends, if we admit the truth of our sickness, we can receive the truth of His salvation. If we admit the truth of our falling short, we can receive the truth of His forgiveness. But in this passage, Jesus isn't just challenging our lies, He's also challenging our reliability. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Jesus wants us to be people who tell the truth all the time, so that people can trust us all the time. So I want to be sure that every word I say is trustworthy. Now, I know this is controversial for Christian parents, but Michelle and I have never lied to our kids about Santa Claus, because as fun as it may seem to create a fantasy about an amazing stranger who lives at the North Pole and brings gifts for good boys and girls, when my kids finally discover that I was lying about Santa, why will they believe what I say about Jesus, an amazing stranger who lives in heaven but comes to bring us hope and forgiveness? In our house, we enjoy the stories about Santa and the Tooth Fairy, but they've always known that those are make-believe. So there's no confusion about Jesus, who can seem too good to be true, but is true and is good. How about you? Does the way you tell your stories to your children, your classmates, and coworkers, and clients give people reason to believe that when you talk about Jesus, you're not exaggerating for effect, because your words can be trusted? This is so important. But even this doesn't capture the whole point that Jesus is making. Earning trust is about more than meaning what I say. It's also about doing what I say. When we make commitments, we find so many good excuses to flake out or fall short of what we promised. We may want to keep our word, but when it's inconvenient, we simply don't. And people learn not to trust us. We reply yes to the invitation, but don't actually show because something came up. We offer to help, but get busy when the day arrives, or we feel tired, or we just don't feel like it anymore. It doesn't really matter, we tell ourselves. Few of us see this kind of thing as a spiritual issue. It is just a personality quirk, but God disagrees. In Psalm 15, David asks rhetorically, "Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy mountain?" As David goes on to list a few characteristics that enable us to remain in God's presence, he includes those who keep their oaths even when it hurts. God expects us to keep our word. And not just when it's easy or advantageous, but all the time, even when it's costly or inconvenient, even when it hurts. And oftentimes keeping our commitments does hurt, which is why God asks us to make commitments in the first place, so that we'll be bound by something more secure than our whims or desires in any given moment. It's no coincidence that Jesus chooses to raise this issue just after talking about adultery and divorce. Indeed, one of the few oaths that people make in our culture is marriage. In the name of God, I, David, take you, Michelle, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until we are parted by death. This is my solemn vow. And God requires a vow because He knows enough about me and enough about her to know that keeping the commitment to love and cherish each other is going to hurt sometimes. And Michelle and I can testify that as great a blessing as it's been, it has hurt sometimes a lot. I skipped over Jesus' words about divorce in the Sermon on the Mount because I talked a lot about marriage this year, and I just preached an entire sermon about divorce in May, which you can find on our website. All marriages begin with vows, but almost half of them end before death does us part. Now, I know there are many complications and extenuating circumstances, and as I detailed in my sermon about divorce, Jesus is not just against divorce. He's against all the ways that we justify not keeping our commitment to love, cherish, honor, and protect, even if we remain legally married. But today, I just want to comment that keeping our commitments I make to other people, including my church, my coworkers, my kids, and especially my wife, really matter. God takes those seriously. And as David warned us in Psalm 15, we can't ignore our promises to other people without it interrupting our intimacy with God. So what should we do with all this? Well, first, be very cautious about making commitments. I like to please people, so my first impulse is to say yes, simply because I know it'll win their approval. Even if I'm not sure I want to do whatever they're asking, even if I'm not sure I will. It's easier in that moment to say yes than to face their disappointment. But as I've matured, I've learned to be much more careful with that. When someone asks me to do something I don't want to do or don't believe I can do, I say no. And I have the integrity to face the consequences up front, rather than disappoint them later when I don't have to be there to see it. Even when I want to do something, I'm careful with commitments. It's easy to thrill my kids by agreeing to do something they want. But how many of us parents make promises to our kids that we later break because we feel that breaking a promise to our kids is not as important as the other responsibilities on our plates? We make excuses to our kids that something came up that we couldn't control. Our kids learn not to trust us and learn to lie when the truth is inconvenient. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy mountain? Those who keep their oaths, even when it hurts. Knowing this, I try to keep my commitments no matter what, but I'm also careful about what I commit to. When one of my kids asks if we can play ball when I get home, if I can't do it, I'll just say so. But if I can and want to, I'll usually reply, I'd like to do that, and I hope we can. I don't know what else will be happening tonight, but let's try to make that happen. It's not that I'm trying to be shifty. It's that I want them to know that when I actually do make a commitment, they can count on me because I will keep my oaths even when it hurts. How about you? Watch your words carefully over the next week or so. Perhaps God will point out areas where you lie or have lacked integrity. Reflect on why you do that. What are you afraid of? Reflect on the truth that you are loved by God and important to Him, that frees us from fearing the truth about everything else. Perhaps God is calling you to be more trustworthy, but that will become easier when you trust more. After too many lies, Abraham finally learned to trust God for everything, so he didn't need to lie to protect himself or prove himself anymore. After a night of wrestling with God, Jacob learned to trust God too, so he returned to be reconciled with the brother whom he'd betrayed. When Peter finally learned to trust God, he's able to stand up before the crowd who'd called for Jesus to be crucified and preach fearlessly about the Savior he'd lied 3 times about even knowing just a few weeks before. When we learn to trust God, we don't need to lie anymore. So Jesus doesn't just give us instructions. Jesus gives us Himself. Jesus doesn't just like the truth or know the truth. Jesus is the truth about who God is and who we are. We are the beloved children of our Father in heaven. We don't need to be afraid because Jesus kept His commitments even when it hurt. On the night before He was going to be crucified to save us in the way that God had promised, Jesus felt how painful it can be to keep a promise. But He trusted our Heavenly Father enough to believe that He would live even if He died. So Jesus kept His word and made a new way for us to be forgiven and live forever with God. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Let's go to our Father now in prayer.